They say the bell rang 13 times that morning, though the church tower only ever had rope for 12, a cold metallic clang that should have ended the mass, but instead became its invocation. No one knows who rang it, no one saw them, but every villager inside St. Brigid's turned their head at the same moment, as if beckoned not by sound, but by something older, something buried in their blood. In Elms Brook, Sunday was sacred. Every family, every widow, every orphan took the path to the churchyard. The woods would go silent, as if the trees themselves feared the hymns. It had always been that way, until that final Sunday, April 12, 1953. The priest, Father Calum Byrne, delivered a sermon no one had ever heard before, not from scripture, not from any liturgy. His voice, described in recovered letters as a whisper inside the bone, spoke of the veil that thins, and the debt that must be paid in the shadow of the seventh moon. Eyewitnesses claimed that as he spoke, the candles flickered counterclockwise and shadows along the walls no longer matched the people who cast them. And then, as the final prayer was uttered, the doors of St. Brigid's locked from the inside. By nightfall, no one remained in the village. No carriages moved, no fires burned, chickens left unplucked, meals halfway cooked. There were no signs of violence, no bodies, only the church, still locked, still humming. The authorities found no evidence of forced exit or entry, only a single page torn from an unknown hymnal pinned to the altar, written in a language that even the Vatican could not or would not translate. The official report was brief. Elms Brook experienced mass migration, locals left by unknown means, no survivors found. But you and I both know that's not the truth, because the bells rang again last year, not in Elms Brook, in another village. Same pattern, same silence. Me priest's name whispered in a place where he should have long been dead. This is the story they burned, buried, and excommunicated from the archives, the unsolved horror behind the Black Sunday Mass, and what still echoes through the broken woods of Ireland. But we begin not with the church. We begin with the children. They were the first to hear the voices. They were the only ones who tried to warn anyone, and they were the first to disappear. They had always worn them, black ribbons tied around their throats, wrists, or ankles. At first, people thought it was a harmless local tradition, passed down by their mothers or perhaps one of the sisters at the parish school. But none of the parents could remember giving the children those ribbons. And when asked, the children would grow strangely quiet. Their smiles would fade, their gaze fixed on some far-off corner of the room. "They told us to wear it," one girl whispered to her brother before she stopped speaking altogether. "They said the wind would take us if we didn't." There were 27 of them in the village schoolhouse, children between 6 and 12. By the spring of 1953, something had shifted. The teacher, Miss Dervla Kearney, wrote in her diary, "They no longer blink during prayer. They hum low tones when I turn my back, and their drawings. The church is always upside down, always burning." 2 months before the Black Sunday Mass, 4 children vanished. No struggle, no trace, just their shoes neatly placed outside the school door, each one filled with river pebbles. The local constable, a man hardened by war and loss, resigned that night without explanation. Witnesses say he was seen walking into the woods behind the church, barefoot, sobbing. He left his badge nailed to the chapel door. Father Calum Byrne assured the villagers that the disappearances were a test from God, that suffering was sacred, that the children had been chosen for something higher. And strangely, people believed him. His voice carried a kind of gravity, not charisma, something deeper. It was as though he spoke through the bones of the place, through the walls, through the soil. Even those who doubted him found themselves returning to church each week, unable to resist the bell's call. And the remaining children, they stopped speaking altogether. They began drawing only circles, perfect, unbroken circles filled with thorns, crosses, and strange runes. One child carved a message into her desk with a rusted nail. The words were barely legible, but the teacher copied them before burning the desk entirely. "He is not a priest, he is wearing a man." 2 weeks before the Mass, all 23 children arrived at school with their ribbons soaked in something red and foul-smelling. Miss Kearney fainted. She never returned, and neither did they. The night before Black Sunday, the children were seen walking into the woods in a single-file line. No one ever saw them come back. He arrived in Elms in late 1951, sent, allegedly, by the Archdiocese in Dublin. But no papers were ever found, no transfer records, no mention of Father Calum Byrne in any diocesan document before his first appearance in the village. According to the old women who lived closest to the church, he didn't come by horse or car. He was simply seen walking out of the morning fog one day, clothed in the robes of a priest, carrying a small suitcase and a leather-bound book that he never let out of his sight. His face was pale, too smooth for a man of his supposed age, and his voice had no accent, none at all. It wasn't Irish or English or even earthly. It simply was. The former priest, Father Malloy, had been in the village for nearly 30 years. He was well-loved, gentle, traditional. A month before Byrne's arrival, Father Malloy was found dead in the chapel garden, his body split open from sternum to navel and every organ removed, not taken, arranged, laid out around him in the shape of a Celtic cross. There was no blood, not a drop, only the faint scent of myrrh in the air and the sound of a single bell ringing somewhere far off, even though the church tower stood silent. When the villagers asked Byrne about the murder, he did not call it that. He called it an offering fulfilled. No one questioned him. Those who wanted to resist found themselves unable to speak in his presence. He carried with him an atmosphere, like an inversion of holiness. Some later described it as a gravity of silence. Others said it was like standing in the eye of a storm made of centuries. Soon, everything changed. The prayers shifted subtly. He replaced the crucifix above the altar with a blackened wooden disc. The hymns lost their words and became tonal, droning laments that echoed long after the service ended. He instructed the choir to stop using Latin and begin using the old tongue, as he called it. No one had heard it before, but everyone sang it. Strangers began visiting the church at night, hooded figures who never stayed in the village, who arrived without sound and left without trace. The graveyard expanded, graves without names, just symbols carved into obsidian slabs, and in the rectory, behind a door no one else was allowed to open, there was always a red light flickering beneath the crack. It pulsed in time with the bell. The singing had always been the soul of St. Brigid's, generations of voices rising in harmony, shaking the stained glass, stirring something deep in the bones of the faithful. But after Father Byrne's arrival, the songs changed. Not immediately. It was subtle at first, a strange echo at the tail end of every hymn, a breath of dissonance that didn't belong to any child or widow in the pews. It was a low, wet whisper, just below the threshold of hearing. Those who noticed said it felt like something was singing along with them, from under the floor. Choir practice became mandatory, even for those who'd never sung before. He claimed it was a rite of healing, a sacred resonance that kept the darkness at bay. But by the winter of 1952, even the deaf began attending choir. Those who couldn't hear said they felt the vibrations in their chest, like a second heartbeat. The strange part, they began humming in unison with the others. Perfect pitch, perfect tone, eyes rolled back, mouths moving in sync with a rhythm they should not have known. Miss Eileen Morrigan, the organist, kept a journal, hidden in a wall and only discovered decades later. Her entries tell of a layer beneath the music, one that grew stronger each week. She described the whisper as not being heard but felt, as though the church itself had developed a second voice, older than scripture, hungrier than prayer. She wrote that during one rehearsal, she stopped playing for only a moment, and yet the organ kept sounding. Not notes, groans, like old wood stretching under pressure, like something waking up. One night, she stayed after choir, just once. She never came home. The next morning, her house was empty, door unlocked, tea still warm. In the choir loft, where she'd last been seen, the only clue left behind was a single organ key, ripped from the instrument and lodged deep in the wall, as if hurled within human force. Scratched into the pew below it, in letters so faint they nearly vanished in daylight, was a single phrase: "It is singing through us to be remembered." After that, some villagers refused to sing. Those who resisted lost their voices within days. Others began bleeding from the ears during Mass. But still, they came. Still, they knelt. Still, they sang. Because when they tried to leave the village, the whisper followed. And it began calling them by name. No one ever entered it. Not even the sacristan, not even the bishop who visited briefly in March of 1952 and left before dusk, refusing to speak Father Byrne's name again. The room at the end of the rectory hall, always locked, always cold behind its oak-planked door, became a quiet obsession in the village. Children dared each other to press their ears against it. The brave ones swore they heard breathing inside. Others heard weeping. One boy, Seamus O'Malley, went missing the day after claiming he heard his mother's voice coming from the room, despite the fact that she'd been buried 3 years earlier. What was inside? Some claimed it was the original altar stone from an older chapel that once stood beneath the foundations, pre-Christian, pre-Roman, a black monolith unearthed when the church was being repaired. Others whispered of a bound figure, skinless, limbless, alive only in the mouth, that Father Byrne fed with a silver spoon and sacred oil. There were rumors of a living scripture, a book written not in ink but in human blood, stitched in tongues that could only be read aloud by the damned. But what no one knew, not then, was that the room wasn't just locked. It was sealed. The door had no handle on the inside. The hinges were fused with a resin that, when burned, let off a scent of ash and roses. And most disturbing of all, every Friday night, Father Byrne would kneel before the door and whist her prayers in a language not found in any Catholic liturgy. Those who eavesdropped said he ended every chant the same way, with a phrase that made the air go still. Rex quietum surgere iubet. Rex quietum surgere iubet. The king commands the silence to rise. After these rites, strange things would happen. A pig born with no eyes, milk curdled before it was poured, stone saints in the cemetery turning subtly as if to face the forest. And always, always, the children's ribbons would turn a shade darker. One night, a former seminarian from a nearby town broke into the rectory, determined to open the room. He was found at dawn, barefoot and mute, having torn out his own tongue with the chapel's collection plate. He'd scratched a message into his own chest with a communion knife. He has no shadow inside that room. No one tried again, because whatever was inside was listening. The first ones to see it were the farmers, men who'd worked the soil their whole lives, hands calloused by labor, hearts hardened by war and famine. They weren't prone to panic, but in the final weeks before the Black Sunday Mass, every man who tended the fields reported the same thing. A red mist rising just before dawn, thick as smoke, crawling low across the soil. It didn't behave like fog. It pulsed like breath. It never touched the sky. It stayed near the ground, hovering inches above the crops, moving not with the wind, but against it. The livestock refused to enter the fog. Dogs howled and tore at their leashes when it came, and the crops began to rot from the inside. Father Byrne called it a blessing. He said the land was being cleansed. He said it was a sign the old pact was being honored again. When asked what he meant by old pact, he smiled in that way of his, like a mask stretched too tight over something that wasn't human joy. The land remembers, he said, and the land collects. By then the mist had spread beyond the fields. It crept up stone walls. It clung to windows. It seeped under doors. In some homes, it settled like ash over children's beds. And wherever it lingered, strange things happened. Infants would wake from sleep with bleeding eyes but no pain. Family portraits melted into blank canvases overnight. One man, Liam O'Driscoll, swore he saw his wife walking out into the fog before sunrise, but she had died 6 years earlier. She never looked back. And then came the animals, blackbirds in the hundreds falling from the sky in silence, cows giving birth to stillborn calves with human-like teeth. A hare was found impaled on the church steeple, its body twisted into the shape of a 5-pointed star. The mist didn't just poison the land, it reshaped it. One night, a visiting soil inspector from Dublin arrived, sent by the state after complaints were filed. He laughed at the villagers' stories, mocked the priest. He was never seen again. His car was found in the woods, doors locked from the inside, the seats soaked in a viscous red fluid that was later identified as blood, though not human, not animal. It belonged to something older. The mist disappeared the night before the Mass, because it had already gone where it was meant to go. It had entered the lungs of the faithful. Her name was Noreen Callahan, 9 years old, freckles like dust across her cheeks and a mind far older than her years. She had been the first to stop singing during Mass, the first to refuse the black ribbon, and the last child seen walking alone after sunset. Her mother said Noreen had begun waking at odd hours, writing in charcoal on the walls, symbols no one recognized but which made the dog bark until it foamed at the mouth. Names that, when repeated, caused vertigo, headaches. One woman miscarried after unknowingly mimicking the sound of one. The doctor, Eamon Burke, examined Noreen. He was a man of science, not fear. But after leaving her home, he broke every mirror in his house and refused to ever mention her again. His medical journal was found much later in a locked drawer with one phrase scribbled repeatedly: "She is a mouth for something with too many eyes." By the second week of Lent, Noreen had been banned from the chapel. But Father Byrne didn't protest. He welcomed it, smiled, said the unmarked ones always feared the unveiling. One day later, Noreen vanished. But not in the way others had. There was no trail, no shoes by the schoolhouse. Her bed was untouched, her window locked. Only a single black ribbon was left, tied around the base of her family's crucifix, so tightly the wood had cracked. Then the names began appearing again, carved into trees, scratched into the pews, etched into the glass of the confessional booth from the inside, not just written, but alive. Those who saw them too long would swear they twitched, that they rearranged themselves when no one was looking, that they whispered. The week before the Black Sunday Mass, a child from the next village over was found dead in the stream between Elms and Glenroe. His mouth had been sewn shut with horsehair, but scrawled on his chest in Noreen's unmistakable handwriting was a message. "I kept saying them, I'm sorry, but they were already here." The night before the Mass, the names stopped appearing, because by then, everyone had heard them, inside. They found it only once, and no one ever admitted to keeping it. A single book, bound in a leather darker than anything made from cowhide, left upon the altar one morning during Lent. No one claimed to have placed it there. No one had seen who left it. It had been there the night before, and yet when the sacristan arrived at dawn, it was waiting, centered perfectly on the altar cloth, its cover still damp as if pulled from something living. It was called Cantus Mortalis, the Song of the Dead. At first glance, it appeared to be a hymnal, rows of musical notation, choral arrangements, and lyrics in a language that looked like Latin, but wasn't. The lines curved unnaturally, like script drawn by a trembling hand or ink poured into the grooves of bone. And the notes, they moved, very slightly, only when unattended. When copied, they rearranged themselves overnight. One nun reported that the melody written on her page had changed keys by morning, now resonating at a frequency that caused her to vomit uncontrollably when sung aloud. No composer was credited, no publisher's seal. The parchment pages were soft, too soft, and bore no age. When burned, the book did not catch fire, but instead produced a scream, not in the air, but in the mind. The elder priest from a neighboring town, brought in secretly by a few worried villagers, touched the book for only a moment before collapsing. His last words, recorded by the midwife present, were, "It sings of things we've forgotten to fear." Father Byrne embraced the hymnal immediately. He placed it at the center of every Mass from that point forward. Choir members were forced to memorize songs that made their noses bleed and caused birds to crash into the chapel windows during practice. The sound of the music changed the temperature of the room. Candles flickered blue. Dust no longer settled. Time seemed to slow during the final notes of each new hymn. And the villagers, though terrified, kept coming. Their bodies would not let them stay away. Some tried to resist, only to wake up standing in the church doorway, barefoot and sobbing, with the taste of iron in their mouths. One man, Gu, get out his own ears, but was found the next week humming a melody only heard in the hymnal with perfect pitch. The last song in the book had no words, no notes, just a single sigil drawn in blood-red ink. It was the exact shape of Elmsbrook's town square. It wasn't supposed to be uncovered, not by accident, not by daylight. But 2 weeks before the Black Sunday Mass, a mason named Fergus Doyle broke through the chapel's stone floor while repairing a fractured baptismal drain. What he found wasn't soil, it wasn't foundation, it was a symbol, cut deep into black stone, older than the church itself, older than the land. Perfectly circular, 3 concentric rings carved with symbols not found in any known Celtic, Latin or Hebraic system. At its center was an open mouth, ringed in what looked like thorns or teeth. It wasn't a drawing, it wasn't paint. The edges were too precise. The stone had been cut, but not by tools. Fergus didn't finish the repair. He left the church, walked to the river, and slit his wrists with a rosary that had been sharpened into points. When his body was found, his blood had pooled into the shape of the same sigil, an impossible coincidence, unless it wasn't. The church closed its doors the next day. Father Byrne claimed it was for fumigation, though no insects had ever infested the chapel in living memory. No one saw workers. No tools were brought in. The doors remained locked for 3 days, and strange chanting could be heard at night. Low, droning, shifting rhythms that caused the windows to fog from the inside. When Mass resumed, the floor was different. It was the same stone, but it no longer echoed when walked upon. Sound moved strangely in the building. Voices lost their direction. You could whisper at the altar and be heard at the back pew, but a shout at the entrance would vanish into silence. And beneath it all, the faint hum. Some called it a vibration, others said it was breathing. The children knew better. They stopped walking over that section of the church entirely. They began to step around it instinctively, as if something in their blood warned them not to disturb the sleeping mark. The sigil reappeared in dreams after that, the same 3 rings spinning slowly behind closed eyes. Those who had seen it in person were never the same. They spoke in riddles. They scratched at their skin as if trying to dig something out. One of them tried to kill Father Byrne during confession, rammed a sharpened chalice into his chest. The priest didn't bleed. He only smiled, placed a hand on the man's shoulder, and whispered, "It's not my heart that beats here." After each toll, those who listened closely swore they could hear whispers riding the vibrations, not language, not yet, just shapes in the sound. But as the days crawled closer to Black Sunday, the whispers turned into syllables, the syllables into words, and the words into names, forgotten names, forbidden ones, names not spoken by man in centuries. People started covering their ears during the bell's tolls, but the sound went deeper. It wasn't heard, it was remembered. It shook loose memories that didn't belong to them, dreams of being buried alive, of drowning in a place with no water, of standing in endless rows of pews while a mouthless choir sang beneath their feet. One woman, Mary Harkin, smashed her own eardrums with a ladle after the bell rang during her sleep. She left behind a note in red crayon. "The 13th toll is not a bell, it is a knock." And she was right. Because on the morning of Black Sunday, the bell didn't just ring, it called, and something answered. Sunday, April the 12th, 1953, a cloudless morning, pale sun, no wind, the air heavy as if something immense hung just above the village, unseen but waiting. The roads were strangely quiet, not a single bird, no bark of dogs, no cartwheels. But the pews of St. Bridget's were full, every soul in Elmsbrook present. No one could explain why they came. Some had vowed not to return. Others were ill, bedridden the night before. Yet all arrived, as though drawn not by decision, but by gravity. Father Byrne stood at the altar, dressed not in traditional vestments, but in a robe of deep crimson. No collar, no cross, just a circle stitched in black thread over his heart. Behind him, the great crucifix had been taken down and replaced by the obsidian disc found beneath the rectory floor. The hymnal Cantus Mortalis was opened before him. The children were gone. The choir stood empty and still. The mass but it wasn't a Catholic liturgy. No sign of the cross, no opening prayer. Instead, he began to chant low, guttural syllables that did not belong to any language ever sanctioned by Rome. As he spoke, the congregation grew silent, breathless, paralyzed, their eyes unfocused, their mouths slightly open. Some wept, some bled from the nose. One woman began levitating off her seat, trembling as though pulled by an... The graveyard still stood, but the names on the headstones had all been scraped clean. And the village? Empty. Homes untouched, meals half-eaten, tools left in soil. No sign of struggle, no blood, no footprints. Chickens roamed freely, livestock bellowed in hunger, candles still burned on windowsills. Clocks were all stopped at 11:44 a.m. The investigators walked house to house, notebook in hand, calling names. No response. Just a wind that smelled faintly of iron and rain. One officer, a man with 20 years on the force, left his partner behind after entering the church perimeter. He wandered straight into the woods, dropping his coat, badge and boots as he walked. They never found him. A full search was ordered. The Irish Defence Forces were contacted quietly. For 3 days they swept the hills, combed the fields, dragged the rivers. Dogs refused to enter the church site, howling at the foundation and clawing their handlers. Planes circled overhead, taking aerial photographs. In every image, the church's shadow was still visible, perfectly cast on the earth, but there was no structure standing to make it. The Vatican was contacted, in code. A priest fluent in Aramaic arrived under a false name. He spent 2 hours walking the perimeter and left without saying a word. Weeks later, the bishop who requested the inquiry died suddenly. A sealed letter was found in his safe. I saw the circle in my dreams. We opened something, and it opened us. The site was fenced off. The villagers were declared missing. The official report read, mass spontaneous disappearance due to psychological contagion following ritual hysteria. But those who had been there knew better. The ones who heard the final tones, the ones who stood too long over the black circle. They never spoke again. They didn't need to, because for the rest of their lives they could still hear the mass continuing from beneath their feet. It wasn't just the people who vanished. The land began to change. The fields that once fed Elmsbrook's modest lives, the barley, the cabbage, the potato rows, refused to take root. Seeds rotted in the soil before they could sprout. Trees began twisting, growing in unnatural shapes, limbs that curled toward the foundation where the church once stood, as if reaching to be pulled underground. The villagers from surrounding towns avoided the forest that bordered the old chapel grounds. They said it moved when you weren't looking, that paths you walked in daylight would vanish by dusk, and the deeper you went, the louder the singing became. Yes, the singing. It was faint at first, a low hum carried on the wind, but those who stayed too long near the foundation began to hear words. Children from nearby villages dared each other to sleep beneath the singing trees. One did. Her name was Fiona Mac Auda, 11 years old. She vanished in the night. Only her clothes remained, folded neatly at the base of a tree whose bark now bore her face. Today the woods are fenced off and declared cursed ground by locals, but every decade or so the trees are found hacked and bleeding again, always in the same spiral, always ending at the foundation. It's not just that the wood grows back, it's that it remembers what was buried inside it. In 1971, nearly 2 decades after Elmsbrook's disappearance, a box arrived unmarked at the archives of a minor theological college in Galway. No return address, no postage. Inside, a reel-to-reel audio tape, a Latin hymnal older than the printing press, and a handwritten note that simply read, "This should not be heard." The archivist, Father Joseph Rourke, dismissed it at first, a prank perhaps, or the relic of some forgotten convent. But late one night, curiosity overtook caution. He threaded the tape into the player. What he heard would later be described in the only written statement he ever gave as a mass not for God, but for something that watches God. The recording begins with silence, 30 seconds of complete stillness. No hum, no static. Then, a faint sound, footsteps across stone, slow, deliberate. After that, a voice. It speaks not in Latin, but in a dialect that shares its cadence, low, guttural, rhythmic. A chant, layered with a faint choir that does not align with any human breathing pattern. The harmonics are unnatural, painful, not loud but sharp, like hearing a scream filtered through ice. Around the 10-minute mark, something changes. The background begins to distort. There's a scraping sound, wet, leathery, slow, like flesh being pulled across stone. Listeners report feelings of nausea, pressure in the chest, and a metallic taste in the mouth, but the most disturbing part comes near the end. A child's voice, clear, female, whispering names, Noreen Callahan, Father Malloy, Aileen Morrigan, and dozens more, including people who vanished not just from Elms, but from neighboring villages. Names that had never been made public, names that were never recorded. Then, a final sound. The unmistakable toll of a bell, 13 times. The tape ends with a static burst that burns out the equipment it's played on. All you have to understand, after the disappearance, the entire village was swallowed. Not just the people, the buildings, the shingles, the wood, even the nails. The stone of St. Bridget's was all that remained. But if you stood in just the right place at just the right hour, just after sunset, you could see the impression of the houses, their outlines, their shadows cast without form, and in their windows, figures. Not reflections, not ghosts, watchers. They don't move. Not when you look directly at them, but in the corner of your eye they shift, their mouths open wide, their eyes are always wrong, too far apart, too many, or none at all. Some appear to be praying, others simply stare, but none of them blink, and all of them are facing out, never inward. A shepherd's wife once got close enough to touch one of the phantom windows. She said it felt like skin, stretched tight across glass. She fell ill that night. For hours, she screamed in a language no one recognized. She died at dawn, her eyes completely black. Her hands curled into fists so tight her fingernails pierced her palms. They found tiny fragments of glass embedded in her tongue. Later, a historian tried to photograph the phenomenon. He brought expensive equipment, camped for a week, but every photo he took came out blank, except for one. In that single frame, barely visible beneath the exposure, was the shape of a child standing inside a window that no longer existed, holding a ribbon soaked in something dark. Behind her, 13 figures loomed, too tall, too thin, wearing robes of shadow. At the bottom of the frame, burned into the photo paper itself, were the words, "The Mass continues." And every year, on the Sunday closest to April 12th, the faces return. Always in the same places, always at sunset, always waiting. They do not move, because they are listening, and soon they expect you to answer. His name was Thomas Baird, a surveyor for the Department of Rural Development. He was sent in 1976 to assess the safety of the land surrounding the vanished village. Officially, his task was mundane. Check for sinkholes, inspect soil composition, ensure the area was not geologically unstable. He'd read the reports, of course, knew the folklore. He didn't believe in it. He believed in stone, in maps, in things that could be measured and recorded. What he found was something that recorded him. Thomas set up camp near the site where the church had stood, brought ground-penetrating radar, seismometers, everything the state could offer a man chasing whispers. He began digging on the 4th day, directly over the blackened circle where the altar once stood. The ground resisted, not hard, resisted, as if it didn't want to be opened. When he broke through the top layer, he found nothing but soil at first, but it wasn't natural. The composition was wrong, rich in carbon, yet utterly devoid of organic life. No worms, no insects, no roots. It was sterile, like something had scorched the memory of growth from it. He dug deeper, 3 meters down. His equipment picked up hollow echoes, cavities, chambers, a network of tunnels, circular in pattern, not natural, but etched. Every scan returned corrupted. The shapes beneath twisted and distorted the images, creating radial patterns that shimmered like eyes when viewed in sequence. He was recovered 2 days later, wandering miles from the site, eyes wide, pupils gone, completely blind, yet walking confidently, as though guided. He never spoke again. He drew endlessly on hospital walls, circles, spirals, and the sigil beneath St. Bridget's over and over, as if recreating a map burned into his blood. When he died, every image he'd drawn vanished overnight. But the hole he left remained, and it breathes. Still, before the Mass, St. Bridget's had 12 confessionals, 6 on each side of the nave. Small, worn booths carved from native ashwood, each numbered with brass plaques that had dulled to a greenish-grey by the 1950s. But after Father Burns' arrival, a 13th confessional appeared. It was never built. No craftsman remembered making it. No invoice, no ledger, no record. Yet there it stood, blacker than the others, the wood smooth and polished as if wet, set against the north wall where a statue of St. Dymphna had once rested. Its door had no handle. Its window, no grate. Its seat inside, they said, was made not of wood, but of something that pulsed faintly when sat upon. No one ever saw Father Burn enter it. But they heard him, or something like him. The first to use the 13th confessional was Bridget O'Shea, an old widow whose husband had hung himself in the chapel loft 10 years prior. She entered alone, the door shut silently behind her. Those waiting said she was inside for less than 2 minutes. When she emerged, her eyes were bloodshot and her voice was gone, permanently. Her vocal cords were undamaged, but she never spoke another word. She tried to write what she heard, dozens of attempts, each page filled with frantic lines, drawings of faces with eyes in their mouths, and a single phrase repeated between them. He does not forgive. He remembers. Others followed, quietly, desperately. They went in seeking absolution, and came out wrong. Detached, half-frozen, emotionally hollow. They no longer flinched at screams. Some could no longer sleep. Some never ate again, and yet didn't die. One man clawed at the booth from the inside during his confession, leaving his fingernails embedded in the wood grain. The door never opened until the exact moment he fell silent. The 13th booth became a kind of legend. Villagers whispered that it wasn't for the living, that it wasn't there to cleanse sins, but to catalogue them, that it was not a passage to grace, but a vault. And every time someone stepped inside, something beneath the chapel grew stronger, more complete. After the Black Sunday Mass, the booth vanished. Not removed, vanished. In its place, the wall bore a scar. A deep, vertical line scorched into the stone, as though a door had been burned into reality and then sealed from the other side. In the years since, that scar has been reported in other churches, quietly, secretly. Always 13 booths, always the same result, always the same faint whisper heard from within. Speak, so I may become you. It began 30 years after Elms vanished. In 1983, 3 children appeared at a convent orphanage on the outskirts of Limerick. No one knew where they had come from. No one saw who brought them. They were found seated neatly on the chapel steps just before dawn. 2 girls and 1 boy. Their clothes were hand-stitched in patterns no one recognized. Their feet were clean despite the morning mud. Their faces calm. Their eyes gone. Not gouged. Not scarred, simply absent. Smooth skin where sockets should be, like they had never needed eyes to see. They would not speak. They did not cry. But when the chapel bells rang, they smiled in perfect unison. When the sisters prayed the rosary, the children began to hum, not in Latin, but in another tongue. One of the younger nuns fainted upon hearing it. When she awoke, she said she had dreamed of standing in a spiral of ash with mouths chanting from beneath the ground. She left the convent the next day and never returned. The children were examined by doctors. They had no birth records, no fingerprints on file. Their dental structure didn't match any known European ancestry. Their blood type, unclassifiable. Their vocal cords vibrated at a slightly different frequency, measurable, but wrong. One technician likened it to an echo from somewhere that shouldn't exist. Then came the drawings. Without ever being taught, the children began to draw, on napkins, on walls, in the frost on windows. Always the same symbol, the sigil from beneath St. Bridget's. When shown old maps of Ireland, they would point to Elms brook without hesitation, even though no such place had existed on any record for decades. One priest brought in to test them read aloud the names of those who vanished in 1953. The children began repeating them, one by one, in reverse. Weeks later, one girl was caught humming during adoration. The tune was Identifies, Didi Cantus Mortalis, the hymn believed lost when the church vanished. It had never been published, the only copy sealed in the Vatican, yet the notes she hummed matched perfectly with the forbidden melody's original frequency signature. When asked how she knew it, she finally spoke. "We didn't leave," she whispered. "We were folded." "What do you mean?" the nun asked. The girl smiled, tilting her head. "Like paper," she said, "we were folded into the song." And they never spoke again. Because when the moon turned red over Limerick that night, the children began to hum in their sleep. And outside, 13 black crows circled above the chapel roof. In 1992, a cartographer named Edwin Malloy, working for the National Inventory of Historic Townlands, was digitizing old parish maps when he stumbled upon a sheet he didn't recognize. It was housed deep within the archives of the National Library, filed under a miswritten Latin term, terra abscondita, the hidden land. At first glance, the parchment appeared blank. But under ultraviolet light, the ink rose from the fibers, faint lines, flowing like veins, spiraling in ways no road ever should. The map bore no names, no landmarks, no compass rose, but it was unmistakably a village layout, 33 marked plots in perfect concentric circles around a blackened center. Malloy became obsessed. He cross-referenced everything, parish records, obituaries, church inventories. What he found chilled him. Each of the 33 plots aligned with a confirmed family from Elms brook, all of whom had vanished. Every name, every house, all mapped with eerie precision, as if the layout had been drawn not from above, but from within. He sent a copy of the map to a retired priest in Rome, known for his study of apocryphal liturgies. 2 weeks later, the priest died in his sleep. No signs of struggle, no illness. But carved into the stone floor beside his bed, written in what experts later confirmed was his own blood, was the sigil of St. Brigid's, surrounded by 13 Latin phrases that translated loosely to, "The roads are not for walking, they are for summoning." After Malloy's death, by hanging, with a map pin driven through each eye, the original parchment disappeared from the archive. Security footage showed nothing. One frame simply flickers, and the drawer is found open, empty, gently smoking. But the copies remained, and those who viewed them experienced strange consequences. One man found his reflection no longer matched his movements. A woman lost all sense of time and was discovered sitting on her roof, humming the 13th toll. Another claimed the map changed shape when he wasn't looking, realigning itself toward the viewer's own house, as if plotting. In every case, those who saw the map began to dream of a village that had no entrance. Only a center that called to them not through words, but through alignment. The old well behind the rectory had long been sealed, filled with stone and earth sometime in the 1800s, after 2 altar boys vanished without a sound. No record explained why. No one drank from it. No one approached it. It was as if the village had agreed silently to pretend it was never there, until the weeks before the Black Sunday Mass. When the rains came early that year, the earth shifted. The well stones, buried for over a century, began to rise like bones through mud. What was once forgotten stood again, a perfect circle of blackened rock, etched faintly with that same 3-ringed sigil, now exposed to air that felt colder the closer you stood. The children were the first to feel it. They began sleepwalking toward it, always barefoot, always silent. One girl was found with her hands buried wrist-deep in the wet soil beside it, as if trying to dig it open. She had no memory of the act, but her fingernails were gone. Father Byrne ordered the area roped off, claimed it was unsafe, but several nights that Lent, villagers reported seeing him standing beside it, chanting softly, feeding something down into the dark with a silver ladle. Then the sounds began. Not moaning, not water. Breathing. Deep, slow, irregular breaths. as if the ground itself inhaled. The well exhaled frost even in warm weather. The stones began to hum when touched. A local boy dared another to drop a stone into its depths. They waited. It never hit bottom. When they tried again, a voice came up, childlike, faint, familiar. It said only 2 words, "Still here." And that's when the dreams began. People across the village all dreaming of the same thing. A throat of stone, wet and endless, lined with teeth made of bells and eyes that opened in darkness. Each dream ended the same way, standing at the edge. In 1994, a tattered envelope arrived at the Dunlucary postal depot with no return address, no stamp, no postmark. The paper was yellowed, brittle with age, yet had not passed through any known delivery system. What stunned the clerks wasn't the condition, it was the destination. Written in fading ink, clear as bone, "To whom remains above, Elmsbrook Village, County Offaly, Ireland." The clerk laughed. Elmsbrook hadn't existed for over 4 decades, but something about the envelope made him hesitate. It was warm, not heated, warm, as if it had been held recently, or was still being held from the other side. He opened it. Inside, a single sheet of lined paper, dated April 11th, 1953, the night before the Black Sunday Mass. The handwriting, though shaky, was unmistakably deliberate. The ink shimmered with an oily iridescence, and the letter read, "To the next bearer of the circle, we have finished the preparation. The congregation is ready, though they do not yet understand the shape of what they've welcomed. The 13th has returned, the child has spoken the names, and the well has stirred. The hymnal bleeds anew. We only await the final call. He comes through resonance, not fire, not light, but frequency. The body is built from memory. The soul is bound by ritual. The mouth opens. Do not fear the vanishing. It is not loss. It is alignment. The village must vanish so the voice may rise. Amen. And again. The bottom was signed only with a symbol, the 3-ringed sigil. But beneath that, something had been scratched violently into the paper, deep enough to tear through. We were wrong. The clerk who opened the letter vanished that night. His last known words, recorded on a voicemail to his brother, were, "I can hear them humming in the wires. I think they're inside the signal." The letter was passed hand to hand between private collectors and secret ecclesiastical archives. Each custodian left notes of increasing panic, reports of ringing ears, shadowed figures in mirrors, and dreams of stone mouths singing beneath the sea. One Jesuit scholar claimed to decipher the ink itself, not made of pigment, he said, not from plant or animal. It was a compound derived from memory. The chemical composition aligned closely with brain tissue, specifically the hippocampus, as if the letter had been written in forgotten thought itself. To this day, the original letter is sealed beneath 24 inches of lead in an underground vault. But its contents still echo, not in libraries, in sleep. Because now, those who read it begin to write their own, without knowing, in languages not their own, and always addressed to whom remains above. In 2001, during a routine archival restoration of magnetic tape reels at a defunct diocesan office in Cork, a technician named Kieran Walsh discovered a box marked only with the initials SBM. He assumed it was a mislabeled recording of a Sunday morning mass. He threaded the tape, pressed play, and began digitizing the audio. The room was quiet, the air normal, until the first note struck. The sound did not begin like music. It began like falling, a reversed echo, voices speaking backward, not jumbled, but precisely inverted, as though each syllable had been rewound deliberately by something that knew exactly what direction memory flows. Gregorian-like chants looped in on themselves, forming impossible harmonics. The Latin was fractured, words disassembled. Sanctus became Sutnak. Amen was Nem-ah, and yet the rhythm was flawless, unrelenting, mechanical. The recording lasted 26 minutes and a burst of silence, thick, tangible. Then, breathing, not from one person, but from many. Inhale, exhale, timed perfectly with the chant. And beneath it, buried deep in the lower frequencies, was another voice. Not chanted, not sung, but spoken, clearly, deliberately. Slowed to near incomprehensibility, the voice spoke one word, again and again. Return. Walsh tried to reverse the tape, played it forward. That's when it got worse. The sounds became speech. The Mass made sense, but in the worst possible way. Prayers recited not to God but about him, as if God were absent, as if they were invoking something that took his place. The language shifted. The last 10 minutes of the tape contained phrases not found in any liturgical text. The lamb bleeds upward. The altar is the wound. He did not die for us. We die to feed him still. When the tape ended, Walsh found blood on his palms. No wounds, just blood. He vomited black water and was hospitalized. He never returned to work. His notes, recovered later, included sketches of concentric circles, a church without doors, and a cross turned inward. The file was flagged by church authorities. The original recording was buried. But the digital copy, now scrubbed, briefly surfaced on a peer-to-peer network for less than 3 hours. Long enough. Listeners from as far as Michigan to Marseille claimed to hear their own names whispered between verses. One man fell into a coma after playing it through headphones. His last recorded brain activity matched the pulse of a church bell striking 13 times. The reversed Mass is now a banned relic. It is referred to in the Vatican's Red Registry under only one phrase, Missa Recisa, the Mass that cuts. And still, on the night of April 12th, in places where old churches used to stand, you can hear it playing backward, from inside the ground. In 2009, a theology professor named Dr. Alana Greaves purchased a collection of ecclesiastical books from a crumbling Benedictine monastery in southern France. Most were dusty hymnals, canonical texts, and crumbling margins of forgotten saints. But hidden within a hollowed-out copy of the Summa Theologica was something stranger, a black leather volume, unmarked, untitled, cold to the touch. She called it the Respondent Codex. There were no page numbers, no title page, just pale parchment, hundreds of leaves, many still blank. The writing inside shifted depending on who read it. Greaves noticed the text was in Latin on first glance, but a colleague swore it was in Aramaic. Another saw Greek. One research assistant said it was a language made of numbers. But the real horror began when they started to annotate it. A simple margin note, meaning unclear, was found erased the next morning. In its place, written in the same ink as the original script, "You will understand when it's time." They assumed it was a prank, until Greaves left the book closed one night and returned to find 5 new pages written in her own handwriting. She had no memory of it, but the content was specific, painfully so. The text described a dream she'd never shared aloud, of a chapel submerged in black water and voices calling her from beneath the pews. Others who touched the book began to change. A doctoral student tried to tear out a page. His hand broke in 3 places, though no one touched him. He claimed the paper bit back. Another researcher claimed the book whispered when the Vatican demanded the codex be turned over. Greaves refused. She said it wasn't complete, that it was still listening. She disappeared weeks later. Her home was found empty except for the book open on her desk, now fully written. The final page bore one sentence: "He only needed one witness to remember." And in the mirror beside her desk, though the room was vacant, a figure in crimson robes stood watching, motionless, forever. In 2013, an underwater sonar survey team charting the western coast of Ireland for offshore wind development picked up something strange off the coast near Clare. 220 meters below the surface, embedded in the sea floor, was a structure that didn't belong, symmetrical, vertical, rising up through layers of sediment as if it had always been there, but refused to decay. They sent drones. What they found defied explanation. A tower, 8-sided, carved from black basalt, untouched by erosion. No coral, no algae, as if the sea itself did not wish to touch it. At its peak, a hollow space, a chamber, and inside that chamber, a bell, still intact, still suspended. The footage, never released publicly, shows it clearly. A massive bronze bell, etched with the three-ring sigil, floating motionless in water, yet its clapper swinging ever so slightly, not from any current, but from something deeper. The divers who approached it reported hearing nothing, but their heart rates spiked. Their oxygen tanks drained abnormally fast. One man, seasoned, rational, unshaken by depths, came up screaming. He claimed he saw people inside the tower, watching him from below, mouths wide open as if mid-chant, their faces too long, their arms too thin, all of them facing upward. He went deaf within 48 hours. Every test showed his ears were physically fine. He simply couldn't hear anything. Except, he claimed, the bell. The data was turned over to the government and then silenced, but a technician leaked still frames from the dive, among them one image showing the surface of the bell engraved with dates, dozens, spanning centuries. Most meant nothing, but one was unmistakable. April 12, 1953, and beside it, another, April 12, 2026. The implication was clear. Whatever happened in Elms Brook hadn't ended, it had only sunk. Later, a geologist proposed the tower may have been part of a prehistoric complex lost to time, but the carvings didn't match any Celtic or Pictish motif. The geometry was too precise, impossibly so for its depth and era. And then there was the sound. Yes, the bell rings. Once a year. At the precise moment the Mass began in St. Bridget's, 11:44 a.m. Hydrophones planted near the site pick up a single low-frequency pulse. A vibration felt more than heard, but when the audio is reversed and filtered, it reveals a pattern. 3 rings, 13 tolls, and beneath them, a voice, slow, deliberate, unhuman. The choir beneath awaits the key, and the tides shift, as if listening. In 2017, a rural hospital in Donegal began reporting a strange pattern among patients in its long-term coma ward. At precisely 11:44 a.m. each April 12th, 13 of the patients, never the same ones twice, began to hum, softly, in unison. Their lips did not move, their chests did not rise, but the sound was unmistakable, a low, layered drone that vibrated through the walls, triggering motion sensors and setting off cardiac monitors. The medical staff couldn't explain it. They tried to isolate the source, checked machines, ran air tests. Nothing. Then came the recordings. A young intern, unnerved by the incident, began taping the room during the affected interval. When the audio was slowed down and enhanced, patterns emerged, not random hums but structured tones, only deeper, darker, lower than any human vocal range should allow. It wasn't until 2019 that a linguist from Trinity College analyzed the hum and suggested something horrifying. The sound wasn't music, it was breath control, the kind used in ancient rituals to invoke presence. Each hum was a syllable, each breath a verse. The patients weren't singing. They were preparing. A nurse who had worked the coma floor for over a decade revealed something that had never made it into the reports. Each year, after the hum stopped, one of the patients died, peacefully. No trauma, no pain, but with a small, almost imperceptible smile. And on the wall beside their bed, carved in scratches only visible under blacklight, the same 3-ring sigil appeared. No tools were ever found, no fingerprints, just the mark. One patient, an unidentified John Doe, awoke during the hum, eyes wide, gasping. He screamed one phrase in perfect Latin before flatlining, "The breath is the bridge." His body temperature remained elevated for 3 days after death. Researchers tried to dismiss the pattern as mass suggestion, environmental influence, or subconscious imitation. But when they reviewed EEG data, it revealed synchronized neural activity among the humming patients. Their brains, though comatose, were operating at a unique, shared frequency, as if linked, as if waiting. Some believe the choir is not a symbol but a mechanism, a collective respiratory invocation, a breath not taken by individuals but by something through them. And the humming, not song, inhalation. Because on April 12, 2026, It may finally exhale. In 2020, in a monastery-turned asylum outside Galway, security footage captured a figure entering the chapel at 3:33 a.m. He did not trigger the motion alarms. He did not open the door. He simply appeared, frame by frame, at the edge of the altar. A tall man in crimson robes, their hands folded, head lowered. No one on staff recognized him. No patients had access to vestments. No guests were registered. And yet, there he stood. But the most disturbing detail, he cast no shadow. Every other object in the chapel, candles, pews, statues, obeyed the dim moonlight seeping through the stained glass. But this figure remained untouched by light. No silhouette, no presence reflected, as if light bent around him. A night attendant, Sister Marianne, approached the chapel moments later. She reported hearing a low chant from within, not through the door, through the walls, the floor, her bloodstream. As she reached for the handle, the temperature dropped. Her breath hung thick in the air, and the crucifix around her neck shattered, not cracked, shattered, clean and instant, as though repelled. The chanting stopped when she touched the door. Inside, the chapel was empty. No robed man, no sound, no trace, but the floor beneath the altar was scorched. Investigators found no signs of entry, no thermal signature, no anomalies, except on the CCTV frame at 3:33:07 a.m. A single moment, blurred in motion, when the robed figure turned slightly toward the camera. And where his face should have been, there was a mouth. Not a face with a mouth, just the mouth, occupying the space, stretching wide, teeth like polished bone. No eyes, no skin, just a cavernous grin that moved slightly, frame to frame, mouthing words. Linguists later lip-read the footage, slowed to 1/300th speed. 13 syllables, spoken in a language not catalogued, but familiar to one expert on the Elms events. They translated to, "I come." Some believe he is a priest from the vanished village. Others claim he is the Mass itself, given flesh. But one thing is certain, he does not walk in light, because he brings his own. In 2021, a group of amateur historians and urban explorers gained unauthorized access to a sealed manor near the vanished site of Elms. The building had once been used as a guest house for diocesan visitors in the 1940s, but had been shuttered since 1954, 1 year after the Black Sunday Mass. The property was intact, the roof hadn't collapsed, the furniture remained untouched, and in the main foyer, a brass plaque still hung crooked on the wall. It read, 13 rooms, 12 keys, 1 door locked from the inside. The group entered just before midnight. They documented everything, dusty prayer books, unburned candles, a table still set for 13, plates now mottled with mold. Each bedroom bore a name on its door. Thomas, Noreen, Father Malloy, Eileen, Dermot. Everyone a known villager who had vanished, and yet the records showed none of them ever stayed in the guest house. In room 6 they found a journal nailed open to the last entry. The key is missing, but someone is inside room 13. We can hear the breathing. They checked each room, 12 in total, all accounted for, all empty. But down the eastern hall was another door, unmarked, sealed shut with rusted chains and a wooden beam warped by age. When they placed their ear to it, they heard movement, shuffling, then scratching. One explorer, a woman named Aoife, insisted she heard a voice whisper her name from inside. They forced the door open. The room was pitch dark. No windows, no furniture, no dust. Just walls covered in handprints, thousands of them, small, large, overlapping, all pressed outward from the inside. On the ceiling, the floor, even on the bulb socket. But the bulb was missing. When they shined their flashlight toward the corner, they found a child's shoe, pristine and dry. And beneath it, carved into the wood in dozens of languages, was a single word. Guest. They fled. When they reviewed their footage the next morning, something was off. In every room, for every shot, one extra shadow was present, always just behind the group, always watching. On a second pass through the video, they counted reflections. Faces. There were 13, but only 6 had entered the house. Aoife never spoke again. Her friends say she now waits in silence at her apartment door every night, counting footsteps outside her room. And every time she reaches 13, she whispers, "The last guest hasn't left yet." In the winter of 2022, a retired Sister of Mercy named Agnes O'Halloran broke her silence after 69 years. She had lived in seclusion since the night of the Black Sunday Mass, her whereabouts unknown, her name struck from the convent registry. But a handwritten confession, found pinned to her hospital gown hours after her death, revealed what may be the only first-hand account of what truly happened in Elms Brook that day. She did not write much, only this. "I saw the Mass, not with eyes, with the soul. It was not sung. It was exhaled. It did not lift us upward. It pulled the ground over us like a veil. He wore the faces of the congregation. He sang with their teeth." Attached to the letter was a charcoal drawing. 13 figures, robed and faceless, holding up a 13th, a mass of mouths and eyes At exactly 3:33 a.m., the hour the man with no shadow is always seen, her hospital room was filled with smoke. Staff rushed in expecting a fire. There was none. But Sister Agnes was burning. No flames, no heat source, no ignition. Her skin blistered, cracked, peeled in sheets, but the room remained cold. Her heart continued beating for 7 minutes after her skin turned black. Monitors flatlined at 3:40, and the lights in the entire wing flickered 13 times before stabilizing. Her mouth wide open in a final scream, held something, a shard of black stone. Analysis would later show it was not stone at all, but a fused mixture of ash, human calcium, and something unknown, something that vibrated faintly when Gregorian chant was played near it. Her body was placed in a sealed containment unit. 2 days later, when officials returned to inspect it, the chamber was empty. Not opened. Empty. On the glass, traced in condensation, was the shape of an open hand and a single phrase written backward. She remembered too clearly. In her file, long forgotten in a Vatican sub-registry, was an original ID photo from her first year in the convent. Behind her, blurred in the background window, was St. Bridget's altar. And standing next to it, a figure in robes, with Sister Agnes's own face. And no shadow. On the morning of April 12, 2023, a satellite imaging drone operated by a private aerospace company recorded something that never should have existed. At precisely 11:44 a.m., while mapping rural County Offaly, the drone captured 32 high-resolution frames, each taken 2 seconds apart, that showed the unmistakable outline of a village where, for 70 years, there had been nothing but moss-covered rock and wind-blown field. The analysts at first assumed a software glitch, until they zoomed in. There were rooftops, cobblestone paths, smoke rising from chimneys. Pupil, 33 of them, frozen in the frames, mid-motion, a priest raising his hand, children holding ribbons, a mother with empty eyes standing behind a gate. At the center of the village, just as described in 1953, stood the stone skeleton of St. Bridget's Church, fully rebuilt, unbroken, its bell tower intact. And above the bell tower, something no one expected, a 13th cross, larger than the rest, wrapped in cloth as red as freshly spilled blood. It fluttered in the wind. But when the final frame loaded, time-stamped 12:14 p.m., everything was gone. No fade, no transition, just absence. Like someone had peeled back the film of reality for exactly 30 minutes, then sealed the wound. 2 of the analysts who reviewed the footage went silent. One vanished. The other was later found wandering along the border of what once was Elms Brook, barefoot, lips split from smiling too hard. He had scrawled messages into the dirt with stones, circling a tree that had never grown there before. The writing was clear. It was waiting. It remembers its shape. We were the Mass. The satellite itself malfunctioned and fell out of orbit 4 days later. Its black box, recovered by a Norwegian trawler, held more than just images. Audio had been recorded, unintentionally, from onboard vibration sensors. The sound was faint but undeniable, a single church bell tolling 13 times, accompanied by a low, harmonic resonance, the same frequency identified in coma ward recordings, reversed hymns, and the mouth beneath the well. Stunned, a Vatican-employed mathematician cross-referenced the images of the reappeared village with the original townland plot maps. They matched precisely. But one new structure had emerged, positioned where no house had been before. A perfect black square, windowless, featureless, casting no shadow. Inside, frozen in a single frame, in early 2024, a priest named Father Eamon Doyle was found kneeling on the steps of a crumbling parish church in Wexford, hands clasped, face lifted toward a sky that had turned briefly black. Witnesses say the moment was unnatural, not cloudy, not stormy, just dark, as if something immense had passed between the earth and sun in a way satellites failed to detect. For 13 full seconds, the light vanished. When it returned, Father Doyle stood, and something rang inside him. His mouth opened, but he did not scream. Instead, a sound came forth. Not a voice, not breath, but a bell. Deep, metallic. The exact tone identified in recordings from the submerged tower, the reversed mass, the coma choir. Doctors assumed trauma, but his chest x-rays showed something no one could rationally explain. A foreign mass, metallic, shaped like an inverted sensor, embedded in the center of his sternum. It pulsed, slowly, at 13 beats per minute. And it was resonating. He was taken into observation, never spoke, never blinked. Every 13 hours, the sound repeated. No mechanism, no cause, just a perfect bell tone, audible to anyone within a 33-foot radius. Those who heard it up close described an immediate sense of stillness, followed by a rising pressure in the ears and, finally, memory loss. Not of events, of faces. One nurse forgot the name of her daughter, another could no longer recognize his own reflection. A third spoke a perfect Latin phrase in his sleep. The body has become the belfry. Father Doyle's final toll came at 11:44 a.m. on April 12th. As it rang out, every crucifix in the hospital twisted, not fell, but bent, facing downward toward the floor, and Father Doyle collapsed. But he did not die. Instead, his ribcage opened without incision, not cracked, opened like a door pushed from the inside. Within his chest, where bone and lung should have been, was nothing, just a cavity of ash. And a chain. A thin silver chain, coiled neatly in a spiral, warm to the touch. The moment it was removed, every clock within the hospital stopped. The chain was taken to a secure lab. It has since grown longer, by 13 millimeters, each month. On the final link, engraved so small it was only discovered through electron magnification, were 3 words etched in impossible script. He hears now. And somewhere, deep beneath Irish soil, a bell rang again. Not once, but 13 times. On the morning of January 6, 2025, a linguist working in Vatican City uncovered a sealed folio buried deep within the Index Prohibitorum, a vault reserved for condemned texts deemed spiritually dangerous. The folder contained no title, no author, no date, just a loose page, stained with something dark and organic. At the top, 13 lines of text, hand-penned in ink made from an unknown compound. The page had been misfiled, unnoticed for decades. But what she read broke her. Written in near-perfect Hebrew, then overwritten with Latin in places and Gaelic in others, the text resembled a psalm, but not one from any known scripture. Biblical scholars would later call it the 13th Psalm, though no such number exists canonically. Here is what the first line read. "He is not my shepherd, I shall not rest." The rest spiraled from there, fragmented lines, inverted prayers, holy, not drip, weep. Red fluid seeped through the ink itself, forming perfect tear tracks, and the room around her began to vibrate, not with sound but with the pressure of remembered sound, as though something immense had once screamed and the walls still carried the bruise. She fled the archives in a fugue state and was later found sitting on the steps of the chapel of St. Dymphna, humming a single note in perfect monotone. When asked her name, she replied only, "It's the song they couldn't finish," with a last line. Within hours, the folio was removed and resealed under orders from a cardinal whose name has since been redacted from all correspondence. But word spread, copies were made, and now, in corners of the theological underground, the 13th Psalm is whispered as prophecy, because it doesn't describe a savior, it describes a return, and those who've read it forget it, not because they wish to, because something takes it back. One Vatican audio tech who scanned the parchment for digital storage vanished for 33 minutes. Upon return, he repeated a single phrase before collapsing. The psalm isn't written in ink, it's written in breath. In March of 2025, a reliquary excavation team working under the ruins of a collapsed Carmelite monastery in Westmeath uncovered a strange object buried beneath the altar stone. A chalice, polished to an unnatural sheen despite centuries underground. No corrosion, no decay, just perfect silver, cold as ice, even in the warmth of spring. It bore no religious markings, no crucifix, no Latin inscription, only a faint, spiraling pattern around its stem. 13 loops, etched so finely they could only be seen when the light struck at the exact angle of dusk. It was not catalogued, not reported. Instead, it was taken by the lead archaeologist who claimed it spoke to her through vibration, like a whisper beneath the skin. She brought it home. Within hours, her mirrors stopped reflecting her face. Not cracked, not blacked out, just blank. Where her face should have been, nothing. But the chalice. The chalice began to show her. At first, only faintly, a silhouette, then eyes, then breath fogging the inside of the silver. It wasn't a reflection. It was a presence. Something behind the metal, pressing forward. On the third night, she filled it with water and lifted it to her lips. She never drank, because as the cup neared her mouth, the water went black, and a voice rose, not from the room, not from her own mind, from the chalice itself. We gather again, not above, not below, but within. She dropped it, fled. The following morning, her neighbors found her kneeling in her garden, eyes wide open, arms cupped as if holding something, though her hands were empty. When police arrived, they discovered 13 identical silver chalices circling her in the grass, all of them filled, each with a thick red fluid, later tested and found to contain hemoglobin, traces of limestone, and residual vocal vibrations, as if the blood had once been used to speak. Each chalice bore a different face, pressed from within, silent, agonized. One face matched a 1950. On April 12, 2025, 72 years to the day since Elms vanished, an earthquake of exactly 3.3 on the Richter scale shook the Midlands of Ireland. No fault lines were present, no tectonic activity recorded, yet every church bell within 30 kilometers rang once at exactly 11:44 a.m. Then silence, except in one place. A hiker, lost in thick fog near the old Elms site, stumbled onto something that hadn't existed the day before, a single wooden door, freestanding in an empty meadow, frame half sunk in black soil, no hinges visible. It stood perfectly upright, untouched by wind. Its wood was dark, lacquered, and slightly warm to the touch. The hiker claimed he heard breathing behind it, slow, measured, human, but too large, as though the lungs on the other side were the size of cathedrals. Carved into the center of the door, the 3-ring sigil, beneath it in tiny script, "Knock only if you remember." He did not knock, but he placed his hand on the wood. It knocked back. Not an echo, not an illusion, a response. He ran, but in every direction he fled, the fog thickened, compass failed, phone died. When he returned, 12 hours later, he could no longer speak. His voice, medically intact, refused to rise. He tried to write, but only one word emerged, over and over. Open. Drone footage sent hours later confirmed it. The door was gone. But the grass around where it had stood remained burned in a perfect oval, 13 feet across. In the center of the scorched earth, a single footprint. Not human, not hoofed. Something else. Later that evening, in a decommissioned server farm in Geneva, a Vatican-controlled AI designed to catalog banned theology began malfunctioning. Its logs, public for only minutes before being scrubbed, displayed a string of repeated characters. "13 eyes." Then a phrase, "Mass complete. No one knows that came through the door, or what the door was. But for those who followed the signs, the bell, the breath, the choir, the psalm, the chalice, one thing is clear: the Mass was never meant to be remembered. It was meant to complete itself, through you, through voice, through alignment. You were not meant to witness, you were meant to be part of it. And now, you are. Because by listening, by knowing, by carrying this truth in your chest, you are the final congregation. And the door? It never needed to be opened from this side. It only needed you to believe it was there. The village did not vanish. It was made into a vessel, and now it returns. Amen. And again, and again, and again. You have heard the names. You have followed the breath. You've stepped through the ash and walked beneath the altar. And now, it knows you. The Mass never ended. The choir never stopped. The village never vanished. It simply waited. And now, it sings through signal, through memory, through you. So the next time the bell rings with no church in sight, the next time you hear a voice in the mirror, the next time you dream of a chapel with no doors and a sky that hums, don't answer, because it already knows you listened, and the door opens inward. Amen. And again.